It is important to understand that when people make use of the environment and natural resources, is that science is the basis of how we make environmental decisions. The thing is, we're going to see that science is not the only part of the picture. Science is there to look at different options and to look at how our lifestyles and how we use resources impacts the environment. But how we actually go about impacting the environment, we're going to see it involves a lot of decisions that include, our cultural aspects and political views of nature. Now, before we get into the actual science, well, we have to understand that a lot of the science is done for the benefit of people. And when we use science to look at environmental decisions, we have to pay attention to the perspective of the scientists doing the science and also the people that are going to be living with the decisions made by science. So it's really important to understand when we're working with people that people have different views of the environment, and scientists have different views of how science is going to be applied based on what we call the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And when you see it with the Maslow's hierarchy is that when people are living at basic needs, meaning basically what we call the safety and philosophical needs, people are living basically at the border. That means we're living day to day, trying to find food, trying to maintain a place to live and trying to keep an occupation and also trying to be safe. And when people are at this level, it's very difficult to think about anything else except basic survival. And decisions made at this level often may cause environmental harm in order for the people to survive, or may people pay not attention to their own health as they're carrying out their lifestyles because they don't have the luxury. Scientists that work in this area are very, that work with resolving issues of basic needs, have to make sure too that they're meeting the needs of the people based on the resources they can afford. So there's a little economics in here too. To meet your basic needs, you have to do it economically so you can have security in what your needs are. As we start looking at higher Maslow needs, that means things like wants, things that we desire but we don't need to survive, or things like appreciating nature, appreciating music, or even just appreciating ourselves and do things just to enlighten or broaden ourselves. Um, these are luxuries that often, exceed the economy of the lower needs or the basic needs. So as we go into a future world, we have to think about the economic status of people we're working with, countries we're working with, and decisions that we make when we set policies that add to the cost of resources or that benefit one group over another. In the past, a lot of our technological development and environmental policies favored people that are living in what we call the esteem and self-actualization level and did very little for people that were trying to meet their basic food, water, energy, and shelter type of needs. And it also a lot avoided people who had the inability to satisfy a lot of wants. That means things that people have for fun and they can't own those things. So this is something to keep in mind too. Another thing to keep in mind is that when people live at these levels that are not satisfied with the level they're at, is that this induces a lot of stress in the person's life. And the stress we see the most is usually people living at the basics, meaning they're just barely meeting their physiological and safety needs according to Maslow's triangle. So, and that means people work with them have to be aware of that too. So environmental science is pretty complex. When we're doing our science, we have to make sure that it's resolving issues in populations of people appropriately. So we look at the nature of science. What we learn about science is that there's this thing called scientific method. And scientific method is really, it's not a bunch of steps. It's not something that you do with a checklist. It's really a way of thinking that we use to solve a problem. And this problem is, how do I explain how nature works? How do I explain if I do this, this is the result of that? And we use these things called variables to address that. Variables meaning measurable things that I can measure or things that I can detect, but also sometimes things that I can manipulate. For example, if I'm looking at the effects of temperature on plant growth, I can use a scientific method strategy called experimentation or running what's called a correlation to test this. So in experimentation, what I can do is grow a bunch of plants at different temperatures and look at how that affects the growth, the plant growth, or affects, the plant health, or affects the ability of the plants to produce fruit or something, like some type of agricultural or economic product. So the science of nature is problem solving. And we use the scientific method as just a term to basically say, man, we have this strategy, and what we do is we usually look at this thing called cause and effect. That means I'm looking for the cause of something that I'm trying to explain or trying to do, and seeing how that produces a certain effect that's desirable or not. And we're going to come across this more and more as we do case studies in the class. Now, what you typically learn about environmental science is just like the chart shown here. And yes, this is a way to look at it simply, but really, it doesn't say all about what the scientific method really is or about what experimentation is. So when we look at the way we do science, science has to be able to identify specific causes for any type of observed event we see. So, for example, let's say there's a pollution release, air pollution release, and people around that air pollution got sick. So now what we have to do is know, well, was that the cause of the illness? Is there something else? And then what we use is this approach to attack the problem. And what we might do is say, okay, I'm going to go with the idea that the pollution is causing the illness. And that's a hypothesis. I could also say that something else might be causing the illness, and that's a separate hypothesis. And sometimes, in some cases, we have to take separate approaches to that. So usually when we look at an issue where we're looking at a cause, we usually look at this, we handle a situation with, we look at one cause to a particular event or to what we call an outcome. Okay, we do use general rules that could be used to describe this too. So we can talk about something called deduction, which means that I use certain events to try to figure out other things that occurred. So, for example, if I said, well, yeah, there was this one air pollution event that occurred, and yes, we do know what made people sick, I could use that to build my hypothesis and then make a general principle about that. I could also use what's called induction. I can sit around and wait for and watch other events occur, pollution events, and finally come to the conclusion, yeah, man, this pollution, all the time it occurs, it causes illness. So there's different patterns we could use and different ways to set up experiments or what we sometimes call correlations or long-term studies. Okay, another aspect of science is we don't just do things once. We have to repeat studies. That means when we carry out an experiment or a study, it helps to do it multiple times, or what we do is we publish it, and then other people try to repeat it for their own purposes or try to confirm similar situations. And this is the strength of science, is that the more we do something, usually sometimes we find out that the more we do it, the more correct we are, or we find that there are exceptions to the rule. And this is why sometimes science seems to contradict itself over time, because sometimes when we repeat things enough, we find out, wow, I was just looking at one unusual incident. Sort of like rolling dice. Sometimes by accident you can roll the same number several times in a row or over a period of time for 20 rolls. And then the next time you roll dice, you might not ever get that number appearing, in that next roll. So what we call repeatability is very important. The other thing we've got to pay attention to when we look at science is we have to do it very objectively. That means we can't put our personality and perceptions into it. We also have to think about sticking with the fact that one one cause to one effect when we're doing it. And we also have to understand when we're doing scientific method, it has to be explained by the rules of nature. And that means physics and chemistry, which is why we will be going into that a little today, a brief overview of the chemistry of life. So the most important concept you're going to learn in this class is the difference between correlation and cause and effect. In science, we look for both. But usually what we do is we look for correlations. That means we can see, for example, wow, every time, there's dirty air, people get sick. And we could even say birds get sick. We can say plants get sick. And we notice this every time. The problem is we can't really make a good conclusion about that because we don't know, first of all, was it the pollution causing the sickness? Was it something else? And sometimes we run into a situation where of what's called hysteria, where people, see pollution and they get sick just by the fact that they think they should get sick. I mean, these incidents do occur. So correlations are important because it could be the basis of us actually setting up a real, what we call cause and effect relationship. That means through an experiment. So how would I do a cause and effect relationship? If I think I have a good correlation here, is that I could, you know, let's say take a laboratory animal or cell culture, or even sometimes in many instances you can do human volunteers as long as you're not causing too much harm to the people. And we could expose them to low and safe levels of pollution and see if a mild illness occurs. And and sometimes this is done literally by even looking at patients that get sick. The problem when you do cause and effect is you also have to have what's called a control. That means is that you have to have a bunch of people that are not exposed to that situation or not part of the experiment and see if they, over time, if they, develop the same conditions or not. And I know that sounds kind of crazy, but that's very important to have. We always have to have something to compare it to. And sometimes what we have to have is people that are exposed and don't get sick. And we have to use statistics to determine that is it really the pollution that's causing the sickness or blah, 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 because most people didn't get sick, only a few. And that could become then a sub-experiment in itself. But these two cartoons here just show sometimes the problems of when we have a correlation. I think the first one is funny where the number of Facebook users determine the dollar yield, let's say, of the Greek currency or the Greek bond. So what this is showing is that the economics of Greece gets better and better and better as a number of people get onto Facebook and whatever. And we know this is kind of crazy that does not, there's probably no cause for that. But the next one might be interesting too when we look at the other correlation is that as we see scientific spending goes up, so does the temperature of the earth or global climate change. Now this sounds kind of silly, but this is real data that we can correlate. And some people might say, wow, scientific spending causes global climate change, or global climate change might lead to scientific spending, which makes sense, of course, because then we know a lot of money is going into global climate change because it's a problem. So be careful when you look at graphs of one thing comparing to another, because it's not necessarily going to be a cause and effect. So in a scientific method, we have to be able to show that one thing is the cause of the other. And we don't say really proof. We show evidence and we even use statistics to say what is the probability of me being correct in my assumption. So in scientific method, we're actually given a problem. To say make an observation, that's kind of old school, but we're really given a problem. And then with that problem that we're trying to address, we we ask questions. We say, okay, what's this, what's that, what's going on, and we use our prior knowledge to do that. From that, what we do is we single out usually one hypothesis. Now, some people produce multiple hypotheses and do multiple experiments at once. But the worst thing you could ever do is do multiple hypotheses during one experiment. You usually have to keep it separate so later on you can know that these things work separately or they work together. And I know sometimes in the clinical sciences they will look at all the hypotheses together in one experiment, but also have separate ones to see if there's sometimes what we call a synergy. That means two hypotheses can actually be working together or against each other. So the idea of testing a hypothesis just means that I'm going to set up the appropriate experiment. There's no one perfect experiment. Each hypothesis, each thing we study requires different types of hypotheses. Okay, and then once we test a hypothesis, we go through a lot of rigor to see if the hypothesis was correct or not. And sometimes what has to happen is you have to say, I got to throw out my hypothesis, when we call that a null. That means, wow, it's really not working, and we could revise that hypothesis. And that means we literally start over again. And this is very common that people, young researchers, run into when they're in graduate school doing their research. And hopefully, before they get that point, their hypothesis is based on so much knowledge that very likely their hypothesis is going to pan out to the proper explanation. Okay, from the if the hypothesis, is correct or not, we draw our conclusions from that. And again, if the hypothesis is correct, at least for that moment in time, or shows to be true, and usually what we do is just say it shows to be true, like with 98% confidence or 95% confidence, um, then we turn that into a principle that other people could use to build their research on. And if that principle shows true over time, over and over again, then it becomes a theory, and in some cases, what we call a law. And a law means, man, this is the truth, but not always, we're finding out. Some laws have to be modified because we left out some variables. And I can't stress enough this concept of observation. So when we are looking at things in nature, we scientists can only work with things that are detectable, measurable, either with our senses or with instrumentations that are using measurements that are universally acceptable. We cannot deal with metaphysics. That means we cannot deal with anything that is outside the realm of science that has to do with, we can't test beliefs, we can't really test, you know, unmeasurable emotions unless you're at a chemical way of doing it in the brain. We can't test faith. So when we look at the idea of science, if people do science on things where they make up the measurement or things that are, you know, subjective, we run into problems. Like to say that beauty, this medicine causes, you to be beautiful, that is not scientific because beauty is a very subjective thing and it's relative in culture. So, and even then, it might be change over time and over a person's lifetime what their opinion of it is. So, metaphysics means things that don't meet the criteria for things that you would consider the actual world. The world of what you can touch, see, and sense and smell, and that everybody else could too. And we call this principle the universal physics. That means what all people accept as what is the world of science. One thing I need to mention about the term hypothesis, because I know in school a lot of times what they teach you that hypothesis has to be done in a certain type of statement, and it's a statement. No, it's a philosophy of how you approach your experiment. So the hypothesis is basically, yeah, it is a statement, and it's usually part of the title of a research study, and it's saying, here's what I think is a cause of something to create this effect. So it's basically, yes, it's a statement, but it's not worded in any particular way. It's just saying, this is the basis of my study, and this is what I think. This is what I hope will be the conclusion of my study in a very simple way. The hypothesis is your guide to how to design an experiment. And this is where you determine what are called your variables, particularly your independent variable, which means the variable I am looking at as being the cause. Some people believe the independent variable is manipulatable by the scientists, not always. Because if I say this rainfall pattern creates this type of growth of trees and blah, 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 you can't control the rain. I mean, it's very difficult. But the rain is still an independent variable. It is going to be the cause of what you're looking at. So, for example, in the tree exercise, the rain we're thinking is going to cause an abundance of a certain type of tree, let's say. The abundance of that certain type of tree is going to be the dependent variable. The dependent variable means it depends on the independent variable. So keep that in mind. And again, when we make a hypothesis, usually what we do is we look at one independent and one dependent variable in that study. And we show that hypothesis to be a good one or a bad one. So there are many types of experiments, and there are many types of ways of doing good experiments. That means ones that are correct, or bad experiments means ones that, whoa, they're not showing what you're talking about, or they're not set up properly, or whatever. So the experiment is basically our way of creating our hypothesis to an actual action. Now, the thing about experiments is that most experiments, you have to have a control. That means you have to have another group of whatever you're studying that's not going to be part of the study, particularly if you're looking at a change in something as a result of your experiment. So if you're looking at the impact of temperature, let's say on the growth of mice, you're going to have to do a set up experiment where you're taking mice and exposing them to different temperatures. But then you also have a situation where you have mice at an ideal temperature called the control. So you can say, well, I'm going to see if mice are affected by cold, the temperature they're used to, or heat. You got 3 experiments going on there right now that you would have to do, one being the control. The other thing about experiments too is that we have to build in some type of reproducibility. And it basically means, you know, I have to have some way of doing it over and over again or in multiples. So if I'm studying mice, I might have to have up to 2,000 mice in experiment undergoing all the same conditions to be able to come up with enough data that is what we call statistically useful. You can't just do what's called a one-shot, subject study, where you say, hey, I'm going to test this mouse and give it A and see if it does B, and that's it, and that's my whole study. Unfortunately, sometimes in medicine, that happens in case studies, but we use case studies as a way to look at it in other individuals. Another component of scientific method is communication. So, we communicate, from our original observation, we're in communication with other people. Unless you're doing top secret research or you're doing research like for a corporation we have to keep secret, but in a general principle, usually we discuss our ideas at scientific conferences or with colleagues or with, students sometimes if you're working with graduate students. And the thing is that we're in constant communication. We also publish our work before it gets published, typically is reviewed by other scientists, and that's not the perfect process, but sometimes it catches, sometimes fraud, sometimes mistakes as that occurs, and sometimes better ways to do the experiment. And sometimes it even debates about the conclusions and what because sometimes we vary on how we interpret an experiment. I mean, that's just human nature. And we also publish usually in journals that are specialized for our type of research. And so this is very important, is that our information gets out, it's not hidden, and it's also transparent. It means every step of that research can be seen in the publication and subject to critique. This is sometimes difficult for people that do what's called proprietary experimentation, where their science is going to be used to produce a product, or what we sometimes call tech transfer, or it's going to be used to be patented. But overall, science is transparent. And science could also be expensive with the communication. Sometimes it can cost a scientist thousands of dollars to have an article published. And we also have to be careful of the credibility of where we communicate. If a scientist just does an experiment and posts it on, Wiki or whatever social media they use, or blast it on the news, that's not necessarily a good idea because it hasn't been tested, hasn't been peer reviewed. So usually what we do when we're looking for accurate science is we try to stick with trusted journals, trusted sources of information in order to confirm that that study is valuable. Now, science has many limitations within itself as far as the type of data you can collect, sensitivity of instrumentation, the fact that science, particularly in environmental science, is very difficult to measure. It's very difficult to know every variable that you control to show that your one variable is causing the effect you're looking at. Okay, but we also must understand that science is done by scientists, and we have our own cultural norms, sometimes religious beliefs, our own socioeconomic upbringing really affects how we do science, how we interpret the science, and who we apply it to. And this is kind of interesting. As we look at a lot of environmental science that is done in this country, new technologies and new ways of doing things, we find that sometimes those studies are done to benefit higher socioeconomic people. And it has no impact on, and sometimes even harms, people of lower income, sometimes disenfranchised or underserved populations, and sometimes it doesn't even help developing countries if we introduce that technology. And this is why I do a lot of work overseas and like doing it, because I'm working with people that have very little resources, very big problems, but they find simple and appropriate ways to, to solve their problems, and ways that make them happy and feel that they've accomplished something. Plus, it puts the knowledge in their hands and not is the knowledge of other people that maybe they have to buy from actually later. So there are many limitations to science. And science does grow. It does, you know, sometimes theories have to be modified over time, and sometimes, very rarely, do they get thrown out. But science is a way of knowing over time. One thing to watch out too is this idea of pseudoscience. And this is an intentional deception. When people use a lot of words, a lot of fabricated machines, and just outright lying to say that something works, or to say that, hey, this is a good strategy to do. And we see this a lot with energy research. We see this a lot with global climate change research, where people just outright lie, or they use correlations that are incorrect to try to say that this is the way things work. So just be aware of that. Unfortunately, pseudoscience is very sensationalist, and a lot of times you hear it in the news. But for the most part, it is not replicated except by people that do the initial science, or people that help that so-called scientist a person along, to get their fake idea through. So please be careful of that. And we do have government mechanisms for punishing people that do, but intentionally fraudulent science. So I discussed earlier about the whole idea of how scientists measure the Earth and measure everything about it and measure nature. So what scientists do is we work with basic physics and chemistry to try to explain the Earth. Biology, living organisms follow the principles of chemistry and physics. So what we have to understand throughout the time of this course is what makes up nature. And we're going to see that nature is made up of energy and matter of different types. Today we're going to focus on matter, or what I call the touchable materials, because you really can't touch energy. I mean, energy can move you around a little and do things to you, but really the things that you find what we call tangible is matter. And matter, depending on environmental conditions, can be solid, liquid, gas, or what's called plasma. It means the superheated stuff you don't want to stick your head in, whatever. That's very unstable, but very important when we look at the atmospheric sciences, like how the sun operates. And we even can create our own plasmas in environmental science that superheat materials to use as a source of energy, clean energy, actually, in a way. So when we look at, nature in general, we have to pay attention to what nature is made of. And nature is made of this material called matter, which matter is composed of what we know on our universe of these things called atoms. So please, for your test, just know the standard definitions of matter. Anything that has mass, and that means, or weight. Mass is a little more universal. Weight has to do with a mass's relationship to different atmospheric conditions, but whatever that, worry about in physics and chemistry courses. But for here, we're going to just pay attention to matter. It has literally weight and takes up space. Okay, and again, matter is made up of these things called atoms, which themselves are composed of parts. And if you break down atoms further enough, you just find out that there are various forms of energy. It's really kind of confusing in environmental science. Most of what we pay attention to with atoms is the different types and how they relate to the universe, and how those atoms build themselves together to form functional things called molecules, and eventually build an organism, and in some cases, or a rock, if you're looking at certain other types of matter. So basically, I'm not going to go into too much detail with this. So I'm sure in your past schooling, you've heard all of this. But for us, this is, if we're going to do this on a need-to-know basis later on, So just know the terminology now. So when we look at what an atom is, and this is our perception of an atom, it's the human perception. It doesn't mean the world really works this way. It's just that this is what we measure and detect with the current instrumentation and theories that we have. So we can break atoms down into 92 different types we find in nature, and probably there are more in nature, we just haven't seen them. And then there's ones that we can make in a lab, which probably do exist somewhere, but they're very unstable, we find out, and break down within sometimes thousandths of a second. But nature is made up of 92 atoms, and we're going to see that living things are made up of just maybe 5 common ones that make up 90% of your body. So living things are incredible. We are very simple in our chemistry. So think about like a set of Legos, and that humans, the Earth has, universe has 92 different types of Legos it can build you out of. It only uses 5 repetitively for all living creatures, at least that we know on Earth. I mean, other planets might have other compositions. And we even see different creatures in different environments have variable compositions of whether they live in extreme hot environments, cold environments, or whatever. So typically we say, the atoms are made up of protons, which help to give the properties of an atom. Neutrons contribute to the mass and sometimes the stability of an atom. That means whether an atom, is stable and falls apart, because that could be a problem if your atomic structure is falling apart. It could also be a problem if you're radioactive, and that means that atom falls apart by basically exploding. You do not want that happening to your body. And then electrons, which also stabilize an atom. That means help it keep its structure, but also are used to help atoms attach to each other in multiple ways, usually what we call covalently, ionically, or through weak electrostatic attractions, or we sometimes call hydrogen bonds or van der Waals forces. So each kind of atom is a very specific type of matter, and we usually use the term element to refer to a particular type of atom, like the element carbon, or the element, mercury, or something like that, which we'll see in a case study. So when we look at the properties of atoms, we classify atom types, again, based on the number of protons within that atomic structure. And the minimum we have, of course, is 1. And then what we find in nature is mostly the maximum is about 92 from what we know, okay, currently. But, all atoms have the same parts, again, but different variations of the parts. So, and we usually see a situation where we have 1 proton, 1 neutron, but that could vary, particularly in larger atoms. So the proton, what we see again is we can determine how that atom behaves under different environments and how it interacts with other atoms, and whether that atom is a solid, liquid, or gas. And it's not something too much for us to predict, so much that we need to predict that for this class, but we do need to know that we categorize atoms based on their proton number, and we call that the atomic number. Now, the neutrons, when we add protons and neutrons together, usually we kind of calculate their weight, and that contributes a lot, about 99% to the weight or mass of that atom. We call that atomic mass. Now, some atoms, for example, might have a variation in the neutron number within that atom, and we call this an isotope. For example, what you see in the picture is we can take an atom that that means like 99.9% of them in nature have 1 proton with 1 neutron. Some of them could have 2 neutrons. I mean, if they have 2 protons, then it's another atom, so it's 2 neutrons. And that extra neutron increases the mass. It might even change the properties. It might affect the electrons, and that could affect things like bonding, and it could also affect the stability. That means that atom might not be able to maintain its own structure, because atoms do come apart, and new atoms can be built. As a matter of fact, the sun produces all sorts of elements, from hydrogen, from basic material, and all the time, certain elements are breaking down and falling apart into other types of atoms. So it's not that they're permanent structures. But keep aware of the term isotope, because isotopes, we're going to find out, play a very special role in nature. and sometimes can be destructive to us depending on their properties. So for the sake of this course, yes, we're going to pay attention to atoms and their properties, particularly when they're found in nature as an atom, like sodium, arsenic, stuff like that, which we're going to take a look at the periodic table in a little while. Okay, but for our functional bodies, for nature, for rocks even, things in our universe are built of molecules. And molecules are basically atoms bonded together. That means attached to each other either very loosely through electric charges, like ionic bonds, and sometimes the ionic bonds can be pretty strong attachments, like in metals and certain types of crystals like rock. I mean, I wouldn't hit myself over the head with one. Those bonds are not going to break very easily. Sometimes we have atoms, certain types of atoms that are covalent. That means that literally their electrons fuse together, literally to almost to the point where each atom is not an individual, but this mass of things stuck together. I mean, literally just stuck together like glue and even fused together. In nature, we're going to see that there's a big difference between how living organisms make use of ionic and covalent bonds. Uh, for example, your flesh, your muscles, your skin, most of your body organs, they have the properties of covalent materials. Very durable bonds. And what's even neat about these bonds is we could use them as a food source. If we can break them down, they release loads of energy that we can run the body with. Okay. When we look at ionic bonds, think about your bones. The bones are made of a mixture of covalent and ionic, but think about crystals, rocks, whatever. These are ionic, and we make use of ionic bonds in very unique ways in nature. Ionic bonds also have the property, a lot of them, of dissolving in water, and also and they could also sometimes attach to covalent structures depending on the type of element. So there are some materials, some elements that are somewhat could behave ionically and covalent. And we have to pay attention to that, particularly in our case study we're going to see on mercury and fish. Some other concepts we need to be aware of in environmental science is the idea of polarity and chirality. Two good terms here. So polarity means the ability to dissolve in water. So we have materials that are called nonpolar. Polar means charge. Usually particles with an electrical charge or some type of positive negative charge dissolve in water and other materials, but we use water as the basis because that's our living basis on Earth. So whatever, what we dissolve our molecules in. So we have this thing called nonpolar, which means that these materials do not travel in water real well. And they also have an electrical charge, no electrical charge, which has an impact on the body. I mean, no electrical charge, or a minimum one that's, not really effective in having charged properties. And then we have things that are called polar, and that means they have an electrical charge of some type on one part of the atom, or the molecule, or another. So we're going to get into this a little later, because we're going to learn that things that are polar act in the body differently than things that are nonpolar. And particularly when it comes to our own diet and how things get into the body and how toxins move through the environment. We're going to learn that nonpolar toxins tend to not travel well in water, but they tend to travel very easily by attaching to ionic structures, like, for example, sand or silt, and that's how they make their way through the environment. They could also evaporate and transport in the environment. And sometimes they even get stored in our body, particularly by attaching to fats and cell components. And that could be a problem. Polar compounds, they dissolve well in the body, but sometimes they have trouble getting into the tissues and into our cells, and actually have to be actively moved in and out. But they could also, be harmful in various ways that, just like nonpolar materials. We also have to look at this concept called chirality. That means certain materials, particularly covalent materials, have alternate shapes for the same chemistry. Just like your hands are left and right and your feet are left and right, okay, is that these molecules have a left and right orientation. I mean, don't worry about that so much from the chemistry of it, but the fact is the function. So if you try to put your right hand into a left glove, it will fit uncomfortably. And the same is true for most shoes. So we have chemicals that act as nutrients or even toxins in the body in one form or another, depending on their form. So, for example, you hear about amino acids in a diet. If you eat not all amino acids are useful for us, even if it's the same type of amino acids, let's say like lysine or something like that. So if we take the amino acid lysine, the L form that's found in nature, and what's called the R form found in nature, which means left or right, or lever rotary, or dexter rotary, sometimes we call it the D form, these behave differently. One could be a nutrient, the other can be a toxin. And sometimes this is even true with uh, um, um, ionic materials, metallic materials, where the type of charge on it can have an impact too on how it reacts with nature. So more terminology, and I apologize for this. So to make things simple, in environmental science, they also do this a little in biology, is we take the atoms and look at them from the perspective when they form molecules, what is the role of these molecules in nature? And we're not giving them intentional roles. We're just saying that in living creatures, this is what we find making up most of the molecules. In things we call actual rocks, because not all things you call rocks are rocks, like coal and coral, coral rock is actually the bodies of living creatures in a very altered form. So we have what are called inorganic matter, which is usually molecules that lack carbon and certain other elements and have what are called ionic properties. And then we have what's called organic matter, which usually contains carbon and several other elements I'll point out. And they usually, have a large variety of shapes and compositions that give us the properties of life. Kind of neat to show you is a pie chart of inorganic material and organic. So think of inorganic as you go and you pick up a standard rock or a mineral type rock. You'll see that that material is made up of mostly oxygen, silicon, and aluminum, or some of you say aluminium, which both are correct. And then we have other materials that we find, at least for our Earth and for nearby planets. I mean, each planet is going to vary a little, and sometimes portions of the Earth vary a little in what makes up inorganic material. But this is the standard structure. And this composition usually forms materials you identify as rocks. Now, when we look at the organic matter, most of it is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. What you're going to focus on the most is the carbon, because that's what's lacking in inorganic materials. And notice the lack of silicon in organic material that we find in inorganic material. Now, we do have some silicon, and we do use it, believe it or not, in making medical structures for us or prosthetic structures, but overall, think of silicon as the backbone of rock. That means what you do to glue other atoms to rocks to make rock molecules. Think of carbon as the starting point of building organic matter and organic molecules. So please keep this in mind. This is very important because we're going to see that with living creatures, if you don't have the ratio that I show you here, that means if you don't eat in a certain period of time, this combination of atoms in the molecules that are composing your body, you're a goner. Deficiencies can cause problems. And so all living creatures literally are in competition for maintaining their chemical structure to keep their body going, to be able to produce energy and stuff like that. And they take in, the equivalent ratio of this pie chart all the time. And they have to. I mean, depending on the creature. And they're going to get it from different sources. Most creatures cannot eat rocks. They can break down rocks as a source of energy, but the material in it is, most of the materials in it are not useful. I mean, we do use many minerals from rocks, like iron, calcium, sodium, and magnesium, but again, we can't use it as a total thing to build the body. Some components, yes. So we literally find ourselves in this world where organic matter is eating organic matter in order to survive. And the amount of organic matter on the planet determines the whole amount of life on Earth. To be honest with you, I love the periodic table. To me, it's a tool. So when we look at the periodic table, this is something of much importance to remember. Okay, we use it as a tool of understanding the properties of materials. So when we look at, the first two columns, okay, that means that, the things running up and down, number one and two, for reading from the top. These are materials that have similar properties. So we look at hydrogen, lithium, sodium, which is given the term Na, which means natrium. It's Latin for salt or sodium, whatever. These are materials that have certain properties in common. As we go down, when we go up to down, when you look at these boxes, the size and number of protons goes up. When we go left to right, again, we increase number of protons, but we're also changing certain properties of that material based on a certain ratio of proton number. And this is kind of cool. So every box you see has unique characteristics in itself based on where it sits on the periodic table. And a scientist can say, wow, calcium is near, magnesium, strontium, which is below it, okay? And that has unique properties that are also similar to each other. So they have their own unique properties, but are similar to each other. Now, for a living creature, that's very critical because we use a lot of calcium for many purposes in building bone, running cells, and making muscles work. But sometimes in the environment, you might encounter barium, strontium, and that might actually be mistaken. Those two materials may be mistaken for calcium and enter your body, and they might cause things to mess up wrong. Sort of like putting the wrong fuel in your car. If you put diesel in a car that's meant to run on regular petrol, you can have problems and the car won't run properly. And this is true for almost every element in the body. Our bodies are mostly composed of, if you look at the green tiles, excuse me, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. These are going to be the biggies that make us up. And this is important to understand, that those big five are what you need to make up basically 99 something percent of your body, and you need those to survive. Any deficiencies can cause problems. We know that with nitrogen and phosphorus, those two together can determine the abundance of life on Earth. It can determine how many creatures are in an ecosystem by just measuring the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus. Now, of course, that affects other materials, but not as critical. And sometimes we call nitrogen and phosphorus limiting elements. That means that they determine the amount of life that could be present in an environment, whatever that environment is in. So the periodic table is a tool, and it helps us to understand too, like for example, mercury, which you can look for on the periodic table, which is Hg. Unfortunate name for mercury is also hegarium, okay, in Latin, is that is a material where it sits on the periodic table that it acts ionic, it acts covalent. And unfortunately to the body, it acts like a toxin. It could interfere with the body. And it could travel through the environment very easily, but also stick to your molecular chemistry. And it can get stored in the body as if it's an organic compound. So certain materials we pay close attention to because they can be very harmful to us, but also have properties that make them even more harmful and harmful that can persist over a period of time. So again, when environmental scientists look at living creatures, we have to pay attention to that they are composed of the molecules of life. And these molecules of life are, again, organic compounds of the many organic compounds out there that are, we can classify as amino acids, fatty acids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids, or what we sometimes call nucleobases. These four groups um, are literally what makes up all living creatures, and most creatures share very similar amino acids, fatty acids, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. We're not going to get into too much detail about their structure, but what's important to understand for now is that with amino acids, they're what we call the structures or the units of larger molecules called proteins. And proteins, we're going to see for many creatures, actually carry out most of the structure and function roles in the body. Fatty acids are also important in structure, and they create these things called lipids or fats that are also involved in body structure, but also um, essential as a source of nutrients for energy. Carbohydrates are major an energy source, but for all living creatures, that means when creatures are needing energy to run their amino acid and fatty acid bodies, um, we eat carbohydrates basically from each other. Plants are unusual in that we will learn that they build their own carbohydrates that eventually other creatures eat directly or indirectly. Um, Carbohydrates are the basic uh, units of stuff we call polysaccharides. Polysaccharides are useful in the structure of plants, we're going to see, but mostly in organisms like us, we store these as a form of stored energy. The nucleobases are most going to be involved in how energy is applied in the body. So you need nucleic acids for creatures to get energy out of the environment and to use energy in the body. And they're also very critical for um, our genetics, for basically passing on the genetics of the species. So we have to pay attention to the fact that we live in what's called an aqueous world. I mean, our planet is mostly water on its surface. And it's in this water that life exists. For water on the planet itself, and there's water on other planets too, but on our planet exists as either a solid, liquid, gas, depending on where that water is, depending on atmospheric conditions and all of that. And we're going to see water determines a lot of other things too, besides being a basis of how we run our bodies, but also water determines the type of climate in a region. It helps regulate temperature of the earth. It's associated with cloud formation and all of that. So later on in this class, we're going to spend more time on water when we start talking about things like nutrient cycling and how ecosystems work. In your book, I'd like you to just read a little about water. I'm not going to read off this to you, the properties of water, but understand that when you deal with living creatures, we have to pay attention to the environmental conditions and how that affects these properties of water. And we also have to pay attention to how these properties of water affect how ecosystems work. So please, again, water is an essential material. It's an essential molecule that again is very fundamental to understanding all the properties of our environment, the properties of our weather, and very many other things, about nature in general. Something else about water we're going to cover a little later too and be concerned about is the fact that water in itself, when things get dissolved in water, they can give water the properties of what's called acid and base. And this is very critical because we're going to learn that each creature has its own tolerance to acid or base, and actually mineral materials like rocks are also sensitive to the effects of acid and base. And what the general principle we're going to learn is a principle called pH, okay, which is a mathematical way of measuring what's called the acid base of a molecule. And what acid and base really mean is the amount of a material called hydrogen ion. That means electrically charged hydrogen atom that is dissolved in the water. Now you could also say something called OH2, or what's called hydroxy, but we're not going to worry about that aspect. So we keep track of the hydrogen as a way of looking at pH. And things that tend to be what we call moderate level of hydrogen, that means not too much, not too little, according to how much hydrogen could dissolve in water, we call this neutral. And most living creatures live in a neutral environment. I mean, our molecules work best when water is dissolved when these molecules dissolved in a neutral water. And it is also true for a lot of our construction materials. Now, when things become acidic, that means that there's um, many more hydrogen ions in the water. It sounds stupid, the lower number, the higher the hydrogen, don't worry about that. But, and this could be destructive unless the creature is attracted to it or a substance is adapted to this high level of hydrogen. With things that are basic, that means what we call a pH of 4 to 8, this has very few hydrogens in it, and again, our chemistry or things like minerals to respond to this. We're going to learn this later as we get into changing environmental conditions and pollution. And when we get into agriculture, where the acid or base of a soil greatly determines how plants are able to use materials in the soil. So what we have to do now is take this whole idea of chemistry, physics, everything else, and put it together to this concept called chemical reactions. Organic chemicals and even some inorganic ones, I mean, a lot of them, um, go through changes. And what's neat about our chemistry is basically run by our chemistry. And chemicals reactions occurring in the body can cause molecules to change, can cause us to move, could also produce heat or take in heat. And we're not going to worry too much about this right yet, but understand that our chemistry is dynamic. It's constantly moving, and we're driven by these molecules called enzymes, which are able to literally be like little machines that run the body. And enzymes we're going to see need things called a substrate, which are what the enzymes do to either build your body or to produce energy. And we're going to learn these terms exothermic and endothermic a little later too, in reference to we're going to see how some chemical reactions require us taking in energy to run body functions, and some body functions release energy, which means we're losing energy from the body, and we got to get that back. So again, don't get too hung up on these terms, but when we start getting into how creatures interact with each other as a source of food and as a source of resources, we'll learn a little more about this. So when we look at the chemistry of life again, the chemistry of life is what literally contributes to what we call the cycle of life, and it contributes to how ecosystems, environments function, and it also links the inorganic to the organic world. So all things are cycling these same types of molecules all over again and over again and over again. And what we're learning is that any disruption in this cycling can create some major problems. And that's going to be the basis of this class when we start looking at ecosystems and what particular elements, what molecules, when they're not there in the right amount or too much of it, impact this whole complex interaction between creatures. Last but not least, two other terms we need to be familiar with as we go along, particularly later in the semester, is the idea of energy principles. So energy, you know, unlike matter, we can't sense it in a way, but we know the action of it on our bodies and in nature in general. So energy is usually defined as the ability to perform work, and work has various interpretations based on the discipline, but work is usually, when an object is moved over a distance, is usually the physics definition. But we're going to, environmental science, not worry about that definition as much as the idea of what's called kinetic energy and potential energy. Because in living creatures and in ecosystems, okay, we're going to use the term potential energy as the energy or the molecular materials or the sunlight or you name it, the amount of energy that is doing work at that moment in time, or the amount of energy needed to do work to keep an ecosystem or individual organism or a cell running. The potential energy, as you'll see, is that it's an energy that is stored somewhere. And potential energy is going to be a fuel for kinetic energy. When we look at individual organisms, and an organism has a certain amount of kinetic energy need, that means to maintain its body, it has to have the potential energy there to back it up. And if there's no ability to collect kinetic energy from the universe, the creature has to have some potential. So we're going to look at ecosystems and sometimes say an ecosystem can have a certain amount of energy stored up with it that determines the whole ability for that ecosystem to carry out the kinetic energy it needs to be sustainable. So these are odd terms, but they're going to make more sense later when we start looking at ecological interactions. Another principle we have to understand, and again, just know its definition from the book, is that when we look at energy, energy has principles of physics that basically it works by. And we call these the laws of energy. The two ones we're going to be dealing with in environmental science is that energy cannot be created or destroyed somewhat. I mean, there's at least, these were written a long time ago, but in nature in general, as far as ecosystems go, and organisms go, this is a good principle. And we're going to see the importance of this a little later. Second law is that when we convert one energy form to another, that means that energy is lost somehow in the process of doing that. So, and what this is going to mean later, guys, is that, particularly for us, is that when we convert energy from one form to another, let's say to run a machine, there's a loss there in which the conversion occurs, produces heat and other things that we're not getting all the energy out of it. And the best way to think about this principle, think about someone says they're going to give you $10, but they have to give it to you by handing it to a bunch of people that each take a certain percentage of that. Eventually, you don't get the full amount. And another principle of energy that's related to these is this idea of entropy. That means energy, I mean, energy that is used to inside of our structures, particularly potential energy, tends to have a way of sometimes decaying over time depending on the environmental conditions. So, so we look at this term called entropy. Entropy is a concept that stable, things that are complex, particularly things that have a lot of potential energy in them, tend to decay. And why is that so? We're not going to get into that in too much detail, but your bodies are constantly combating breaking apart and falling apart, and and we have to live a life. That means by eating, by doing other body processes that slow that down or prevent it from occurring. So where are we going to see these laws of thermodynamics? Mostly a little when we look at ecosystems, but a lot when we start looking at the feasibility of energy and its alternatives. Because this is going to be where it's really critical when we have a natural resource that we use for energy that's very scarce, and we're using it in a way that much of that energy does not produce its full potential, and that can cost a lot of money. So to end this all today, biological systems, we're made up of molecules that work using the principles of or the laws of energy. And we're going to pay close attention to a lot of different types of measurements. But one of the very important measurements we're going to deal with this class is a unit called a calorie, which is an energy unit. Because we can see that calories can be used to measure literally the viability of organisms. We can measure the amount of calories in a forest. And as far as potential energy goes, it says this potential energy, at least a certain percentage of it, could be used for this, this, and this, and maintain a certain amount of squirrels or whatever you name it. So a lot of these terms, you know, know the names, know the general principle, because again, we will come back to this as we go through the class. And this is the end of the lecture. Thank you.